So you'll notice that I don't have any slides. So this is a very old school presentation and probably very different from everything else you'll be getting today in that regard. But I want to start by telling you a story. And it is the first story actually in my book. And it's the story of a British scientist, a man named Francis Galton. Now, some of you probably know who Francis Galton is. He is famous for being the founder in some ways of what we think of as modern social statistical analysis. He was one of the first people to really think hard about how you could use statistical analysis to think about the way groups of people and societies worked. But Galton is also famous, or let's say infamous, for another reason, which is that he was the founder of what we now think of as eugenics. So he was someone who was really a notorious elitist. He basically thought that only a very few people in the world had the capabilities that were necessary to learn, to make good decisions, and to solve problems. But the story I'm going to tell you is the story about him coming up against some evidence that his basic assumptions about the world might in fact be wrong. So on a particular day about a century ago, Galton was wandering through a country fair in the west of England. It was a fair much like the ones we have in the United States, where people would come, they would bring their livestock and their produce, and they would show it off. And as Galton was wandering through the fair that day, he came across this contest. The contest was that an ox had been placed on display, and people were lined up to guess the weight of the ox. Now, the task they were actually being asked to solve was to guess the weight of the ox after it had been slaughtered, which was sort of unfortunate for the ox, but basically made the task they were trying to solve a little more complicated than it might otherwise have been. And as Galton described it, the crowd that day was a very big one. There were almost 800 people in the crowd. And it was also, and this is very important, it was also a diverse crowd. So some of the people in the crowd were butchers and farmers. These were people for whom it was probably important in one way or another to be able to guess the weight of an ox. So you could consider them in some sense kind of experts in the task. But a lot of the people in the crowd were local merchants or clerks or family members. You know, they were just people who were out at the fair and were just kind of taking a flyer on this question. So they were people who, at least on the surface, would seem to have had no kind of insider knowledge of cattle. So after the contest was over, Galton took all of the guesses and he ran a series of tests on them. He graphed them from high to low to see if they formed a bell curve. He calculated the standard deviation of the guesses. And then he did something very simple. He just took the average of the group's guesses. Now that number represented, I'll say, the kind of collective intelligence of the group. So if it had been one person, that's how much it would have guessed the ox had weighed. Now Galton was convinced that the crowd's guess was going to be way off the mark because, as I said, he was a notorious elitist, so what he thought he was looking at was a crowd made up of a few smart people, a few mediocre people, and then a lot of morons, because he basically thought everyone was dumb. So he was really convinced that collectively the crowd was going to be quite stupid. But as it happens, Galton was wrong, because the crowd had guessed that the ox would weigh 1,197 pounds. And when all was said and done, the ox weighed 1,198 pounds. So that in other words, the crowd's judgment was essentially perfect. And what I want to talk to you about today is the notion that this was not a coincidence, nor was it a phenomenon that is confined to livestock weight guessing, but that it actually was an example of a very powerful, and I'll argue potentially enormously useful phenomenon that I call the wisdom of crowds. The idea of it, as Paul alluded to, is that under the right circumstances, groups of people can be remarkably intelligent. And they can actually often even be smarter than the smartest person in the group. And what this means, I think, is that if you can figure out ways, many of which I think many of you are already experimenting with and using on a regular basis, if you can figure out ways to tap into the collective intelligence of groups, and those groups can be anything from a classroom to a school to larger organizations, if you can figure out how to do that successfully, then what you can do is dramatically improve your creativity, improve your ability to make decisions, and even in some circumstances, improve your ability to actually forecast the future. Now, the key to the definition of the wisdom of crowds is that phrase, under the right circumstances. Because as we're all familiar with, and I'm sure many of you are already thinking of examples, there are many circumstances in which groups are far from wise, in which they are, on the one hand, oftentimes very extreme in their judgments, so that the group actually makes decisions or comes to judgments that are much worse than any one person would come to. Or on the other hand, groups are oftentimes very mediocre. They oftentimes kind of gravitate to the lowest common denominator. And I think both of these are very real phenomena. And so the question really is, what does it take to actually make a crowd wise? And that's really what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about today. But before I do that, what I want to do is give you some more examples of kind of the wisdom of crowds in action. And what I'm going to do is start with some very simple examples and then go to more complex ones. And what I think you'll see is that even as the problems groups are asked to solve get more complicated, the solutions they offer become, if anything, more impressive. Well, let's start with a very simple example, and it's actually the simplest example of the wisdom of crowds, and that is the jelly bean experiment. So some of you may have done this. They sometimes do it in school. They usually do it in business school classes, but you sometimes see it at a fair or at a party or something like this. And the way it works is pretty simple. You take a jar of jelly beans and you ask a group of people to guess how many jelly beans are in that jar. And if you do that, what you find is that the group's answer is typically exceptionally good. It's usually between about 3 and 5% of the number of beans in the jar, and it's typically better than about 95% of the people in the room. I actually did this experiment about 3 or 4 months ago with a group of about 100 people, which actually is not that many. And the jar I showed them had 1,323 beans in it. And the group's average guess was 1,323. Now, that's actually pretty unusual. Usually when you do it once, a few people in the room actually do better than the group as a whole. But if you do it 3 or 4 times with 3 or 4 different jars of jelly beans, what you find is that no one person in the room actually outperforms the group as a whole. Similarly, the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which some of you are probably familiar with, on that show, if a contestant gets stumped, they have a couple of things they can do to try to help themselves out. So one of the things they can do is they can phone a friend who they have nominated beforehand as an expert in the field. When you go on the show, what you actually do is you give the producers, I think, 5 names. And you say, if the question is in English literature, call William. And if the question is in astrophysics, call Mary, basically. The other thing you can do is you can just poll the audience. Now, the experts do reasonably well. They get the answers right about 2/3 of the time, which, it's not bad given that there's a lot of pressure, they're on television, there's a limited amount of time in which to answer, and so on. But the audience gets the answer right 91% of the time. Now, if you think about it, this is a group of people. They have nothing better to do with their days than spend them in a TV studio in the middle of Los Angeles, basically. But you ask them a question, and they give you the right answer 9 out of 10 times. Now, I'll grant you that the questions they're being asked to answer often have to do with things like, what was Britney Spears' second album or something like that. But the interesting thing is that even as the problems groups are asked to solve get more difficult and more complex, you can actually see this exact same phenomenon at work. So probably the place where the wisdom of crowds has become most visible and most relevant to our everyday lives is the internet. The internet provides, and as all of you are very familiar with, a kind of unparalleled tool for aggregating and allowing people to work collectively on very difficult and very interesting problems. It is in some ways actually an almost perfectly well-designed tool to enhance collaboration. And people have taken enormous advantage of this tool. So obviously, things like Wikipedia, which although the way knowledge gets aggregated on Wikipedia is very different from some of the other examples we've already talked about, in the end, the entries on Wikipedia represent, you could say, the kind of collective judgment of Wikipedia's users, who are essentially deciding whether to change or not change entries as they go. And for all of the problems that Wikipedia has, it represents really an extraordinary resource, one that represents the sort of collective labor and collective intelligence of thousands and arguably hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. Google, which I think for me is kind of the exemplary demonstration of the wisdom of crowds, obviously enormously valuable, has gone from essentially nothing to one of the most valuable companies in the world in the space of a decade. And the key to Google's success, I would really argue, is that at least initially, its search engine simply did a better job of finding information than its competitors did. And the way Google does this, basically, is by tapping the collective intelligence of the internet. At the core of Google's search engine is something called the Pagerank Algorithm. And that is really, in some respects, simply a voting system. So what Google basically does when you type a search into it is it basically goes out and surveys the internet as a whole and basically asks it, where is the information this person is looking for? It does that by treating a hyperlink as a vote on the value of that page. So it aggregates all of those links, adds a variety of Google special sauces, basically, and comes out with its results. And the interesting thing about this is, I use Google, like most of you probably, 40 or 50 times a day, which if you think about it, the internet, wonderful as it is, there are no barriers to entry on the net. Anyone can start a website, anyone can link from one website to another. So you might think that if you aggregated all of those links, that what you would end up with is stupidity or chaos. But what Google's founders recognized very early on is that underneath that seeming surface chaos, there really is a remarkable hidden order and a remarkable hidden intelligence. So that they actually have built this incredibly useful tool, in effect, by tapping the wisdom of crowds of the net. And you can see the same phenomenon at work in education as well. So there are a whole host of sites now that are attempting to provide tools, both that you can use in the classroom, and I'm going to talk more later on about exactly what it takes to make classroom dynamics work effectively, but also to actually deal with bigger questions. So Classroom 2.0, which some of you are probably familiar with, provides a tool for, I think at this point it's 60 or 70,000 educators to actually come together and collaborate, both in kind of raising problems, but also in trying to think hard about how you can actually solve those problems. Collaborized Classrooms, a title name that I'm not exactly, I think is a little awkward, but actually provides tools and practices that allow you to use the net to kind of aggregate the knowledge in a classroom and allow students to actually make decisions and help lead discussions in ways that I think teachers have found surprisingly useful. And on a bigger level, if you think about the academic community as a whole, to me, the academic community exemplifies, in some respects, the wisdom of crowds. So one of the examples that I find especially fascinating is something like SARS. When the SARS epidemic began, and people had no real idea of what was going on with it or what was causing it, but the SARS virus was discovered and basically broken down in a very short period of time. And it was done so by a collaborative network of laboratories around the world. A collaborative network that was not actually led by any one person, but that actually represented the collective intelligence of labs all over the world. And that is the way academic research in general has been going, obviously, over the last couple of decades. So that now most papers, most research in the academic community is produced collaboratively. And one of the very striking things is that actually the most highly regarded scientists actually tend to collaborate more, not less. And so I think what we are moving away from, and it sounds from talking to people here already, that this is something you're very familiar with in your classrooms. We are moving away from a model in which knowledge is all about the single individual seeker and moving toward a recognition that the collective intelligence of classrooms, of schools, and of organizations is actually much greater than any one person. Now, you can also see the same phenomenon at work in trying to forecast the future, which can be very useful if you're trying to figure out where your institutions should be going. What kinds of projects are worth thinking about? What kinds of projects are worth investing your time and energy in? And you can see this phenomenon at work across a wide variety of fields. So my favorite example of the wisdom of crowds comes from sort of a strange place, which is the racetrack. So can I ask, does anybody here go to the racetrack? Oh, actually, that is more yeses than I usually get when I ask this question. And that makes me very happy. That makes me very, very happy because I actually really think if you have the time, it's worth going to the track and just spending a day there and place a few bets. Because what you will see if you go to the track is you will see about as perfect an example of a prediction machine in action as you can imagine. So in the United States, I'm not sure how it works in Hong Kong, but in the United States, the odds on horses are set not by a bookie, by some smart bettor. They actually are set by the crowd. So we use what's called a parimutuel system, in which every bet that is placed actually affects the final odds. And what's interesting about this is that what you find if you actually look at the odds on horses is that they predict almost perfectly how likely a horse is to win. So what I mean by that is not that the favorites win all the time. What I mean is that horses that go off at 2-to-1 odds, they win just about a third of the time. Horses that go off at 4-to-1 odds win a fifth of the time, and so on. And the odds really map almost perfectly onto the actual outcomes. In other words, what the crowd of bettors is doing, in probabilistic terms, is offering up an almost perfect forecast of an uncertain future. Now think about it. I mean, this is a future that involves animals who may or may not know that they're in a race. It involves jockeys who are doing all sorts of things to make their horses run faster, some legal, some not. Track conditions that can vary quite wildly, even within a day. The crowd of bettors is taking all those factors into account and coming up with a remarkably prescient prediction of what actually is going to happen. And what's interesting about this is that the crowd of bettors is not made up solely of experts. In fact, if you go to the track, what you'll find is that while there are plenty of sort of gamblers there who are spending all day long looking at, in the US, it's the daily racing form and talking to trainers and so on, there are also plenty of people there who are just there to have a nice day out at the track. And these are people who bet on horses for a wide range of reasons, including things like the horse's name reminds them of their mother, or they only bet on chestnut-colored horses. Someone actually told me that after a talk I gave. And yet, when you aggregate all of those bets, smart, well-informed, ill-informed, what you end up with is a really good picture of what actually is going to happen. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that you want to set up parimutuel betting markets inside your schools or your classrooms, but I do think actually that what that crowd of bettors is doing is very analogous to what any institution has to do. Right? You have to decide. We have a range of options. Here are things that we're worth doing or not worth doing. How do we decide what those are? And in the same way that the crowd of bettors collectively is very good at assigning probabilities to a range of horses, let's say 7 horses, I think institutions can actually do the very same thing. And you can actually see a similar kind of phenomenon at work in what are sometimes called prediction markets. So these are markets, public markets, where people come together to essentially bet on a wide range of outcomes. There are markets that are about sports. There are markets that are about politics. The political markets in the United States, for instance, have been extraordinarily successful at predicting the outcome of elections. Not just who's going to win, but also what percentage of the vote they're going to get. In fact, the most successful market in the US, called the Iowa electronic market, not a very big market, but it is relatively popular. That market has been more accurate than political polls about 3/4 of the time. Organizations have used these markets, so companies have used them internally to try to predict things like which kinds of projects will succeed, which will fail, when will things get done, which is a question that is sometimes hard to get a good answer to. When you ask people, when will this be finished, it's sometimes hard to get a good answer to. So companies ranging from Siemens, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, and so on have used prediction markets with great effect. It's improved the accuracy of their forecasts, and actually in some cases it's actually also improved the efficiency and speed of their forecasts. There's an organization in the United States called the National Institute for Technology and Liberal Education that actually is using prediction markets right now to try to think about the future of education. So you can actually go there, and they run a variety of prediction markets where they're trying to aggregate the collective intelligence of educators to try to predict both what will happen and also what should happen. And the idea there really is that it's the collective intelligence of educators that's going to provide the best forecast of what actually is going to happen, both on a policy level, but also in some ways, more importantly, on a classroom and pedagogical level as well. Now, the basic idea here, the reason why I think all of these things work well and why I think they can be extraordinarily valuable, and why the concept of the wisdom of crowds is so important, is really that what it allows you to do is it allows you to get around a lot of the problems that sometimes interfere with collaboration and also with the flow of information. So we spend a lot of time trying to make better decisions. We try to spend a lot of time trying to sort of improve the way we do things. But the reality is that when people get together in groups and in organizations, it is sometimes hard for information to flow freely. You know, there are obstacles that get set up. Obstacles sometimes set up by bureaucracy, sometimes set up by interpersonal dynamics. I think one of the things that's neat about wisdom of crowds tools, about collaboration tools, is that what they allow you to do, if you use them well, is they allow you to get around a lot of those obstacles. They actually allow people to offer up their true opinions in a way that sometimes organizational hurdles and sometimes even in the classroom make it difficult for people to do. And so the idea here is really to try to cast your net as widely as possible. So I think one of the things you really find when you look at the studies of the wisdom of crowds is that one of the things that's very striking is that information is oftentimes located in places where we don't think first to look. So we sometimes think we know exactly where we can find what we need. And the reality is sometimes it's located somewhere else. And if you cast your net widely enough, what happens is that information kind of rises to the top, and you're allowed to actually really reap the benefits of the collective intelligence of whatever group you're trying to tap. Now, the catch, or the key to the wisdom of crowds really is that it only works under some circumstances. Because, you know, we can all think right off the top of our heads of examples of the wisdom of crowds not being operative at all. And we can all think of examples of really the folly of crowds. So think about the stock market bubble of the late 1990s. Think about the housing bubble that we just lived through, at least in the United States. And we can also think of mobs, lynch mobs, riots. These are all examples of crowds acting in really foolish or extreme ways. And we can also think very easily of groups really falling below their great potential. So many of us have probably had the experience of, you know, you go into a meeting. Sometimes this also happened in a classroom. You go into a meeting, you've been in the meeting for 15 minutes, and you look around the room and you say to yourself, we are all now dumber than we were when we came into this room, basically. You know, you sit in the room and the level of intelligence just kind of sinks. And the reality is that we spend a lot of time in groups in one way or another. Obviously, as teachers, you spend an enormous amount of time in groups. And yet the experience of collaboration for a lot of people is oftentimes quite frustrating. And I think the question there really is, well, how do we change that? How can we actually make it, and if it's not frustrating, how can we make it even better? And so what I want to talk about now is what does it take for crowds to really be wise? So this is really the kind of theory behind the practice. So I think that there are three fundamental conditions of the wisdom of crowds. The first one, which is actually really simple, but is a step that we sometimes fall down on, is that we want to aggregate everyone's opinions and put them together, kind of produce a collective judgment or to produce a collective product. This doesn't operate just in terms of decision making. One of my favorite examples of the wisdom of crowds is a group at Skidmore, a class at Skidmore, that used wikis to collectively write a Greek tragedy in English. And that's the kind of production that, essentially the tools we're talking about actually allow you to do. But what you want to do is you want to have some form to actually aggregate lots of different opinions to produce a collective. So when I talk about the wisdom of crowds, I'm not talking just about a suggestion box. You don't want a model in which people just kind of offer up ideas and then someone at the top or the teacher just kind of goes through and says, all right, this works, this doesn't. Ideally, you want to try to actually tap everyone's intelligence and allow it to actually rise to the surface in some aggregated form. There are lots of different ways you can do this, and obviously it depends to a great degree on the task. So it's what Galton did when he just took the average of the group's guesses, but it's also what a wiki does, and so on. So there are lots of different ways to do it. The key is really aggregation does really matter. The second characteristic of the wisdom of crowds, and I think the most important, is cognitive diversity. So when I talk about the value of diversity, in the United States at least, when you hear the word diversity, the first things that come to mind are sort of sociological diversity. And sociological diversity can be tremendously valuable in groups. But what I think the real key is what I call sort of cognitive diversity. And by cognitive diversity, I mean a couple of things. One is you want people who are thinking about problems from lots of different perspectives. So they're coming at the problem from lots of different angles. You also want people who are using different kinds of heuristics, different sort of problem-solving tools to think about how to try to solve problems. And so if you have those two things, your crowd is actually going to be much wiser than it otherwise would be. Because generally speaking, diverse crowds are going to be not just more sort of open than homogeneous crowds, they're also going to be smarter. So there's a political scientist at the University of Michigan, a guy named Scott Page, who's done a lot of work on the problem-solving value of diversity. He wrote a really wonderful book called The Difference, which talks a lot about this in great detail, great mathematical detail. And it's a really fascinating book that I highly recommend. Scott does a lot of experiments with computer agents, because what that allows him to do is actually look at how the agents are actually solving problems. So one of the things he does is he takes a large group of computer agents and he has them try to solve a mathematical problem on their own. So they each do it individually. And when he's done, what he can do is he can actually rank them. So some of them are exceptionally good at solving the problem, some of them are pretty good, and then some of them are mediocre. Then what he does is he divides them into two groups. So one is made up of the best of the best. So this is the cream of the crop of the problem solvers. The second group is basically assembled at random. It includes some of the really brilliant ones, some of the pretty good, and then some of the mediocre ones. And then he has both groups try to solve another problem collectively. And what he finds is that although the best of the best group does do well in solving the problem, it's outperformed by the random group about 90% of the time. Now, the random group is not as smart. Its average IQ is actually lower, but its collective intelligence is greater. And the reason why Scott can show is he actually goes in and looks at how these groups are actually trying to solve this problem. And what he finds is that the random groups actually consider a wider range of alternatives. They're less likely to get hung up on sort of wrong answers, and that is to say that they become less convinced. They're not as convinced that their answers are right. And the reason he finds this to be the case is that the ones at the lower end of the spectrum, right, they're not as smart, they're not as good at solving the problem, but they're thinking about the problem differently. They're using different perspectives to frame the problem, and they're also using different problem-solving tools. Now, this isn't so great for them as individuals, as it happens, is why they're not as effective. But in the group, what it means is that the groups are considering a much wider range of alternatives and are actually sort of better at exploring new terrain. And as a result, tend to arrive at answers more quickly, but also more effectively as well. Now, the lesson of the story is not that you want stupid people in your teams or whatever, basically. But it does mean that cognitive diversity really has tremendous value. And it actually means that you can know less and still add value as long as what you know is different. And this has interesting implications for the classroom, for schools in general. Because one of the things Page talks about is that as we sort of progress, as we move toward expertise, that experts tend to become more like each other, actually. And as a result, their diversity, in a sense, kind of shrinks. So if you actually assemble a crowd of people who are at the top of their profession, and arguably even at the top of the school or whatever, that what you're going to find is that that group is less diverse, that actually in terms of the way they think about problems, they're probably going to be more like each other than less like each other. And this makes sense. This is one of the reasons why you become so effective. But the consequence of that is that actually more diverse groups are actually therefore more likely to be collectively intelligent. Now, there are all sorts of interesting implications for how we track students and group them in this. But I think the obvious takeaway is that the more diverse a group, a classroom is, the more interesting and arguably the more productive its solutions are actually going to be. This also has implications for how we think about ourselves and how we think about the way we learn. So one of the more interesting examples of kind of collective intelligence out there is what are sometimes called personal learning networks. They're sometimes called professional learning networks as well, right? And these are networks that allow you to take advantage of the enormous possibilities digital technology offers in terms of accessing the knowledge of people really around the world, right? Professionals, people in your peers, etc., around the world. And the implication of what I'm talking about when it comes to diversity, when you think about personal learning networks, is very interesting. Because what it means is that what you want to try to do is keep those networks as open as possible. One of the tendencies we have when we go about forming groups is we tend to form groups and pair up with people, to network with people who are very similar to us. We tend to have very strong, tight ties to people in our network much of the time. And this actually, from a wisdom of crowds perspective, is the wrong thing to do. What you actually want are lots of weak, loose ties rather than a few tight ties, because the more weak ties you have, the more diverse the network you're tapping. And as a result, the kind of better the knowledge and aggregation you're actually going to end up with. Now, diversity is also valuable in other ways. Diversity is valuable because it actually lessens the chance that everyone in the group is going to be making the same kind of mistake. So there's a joke about actuaries. It's maybe the only joke about actuaries, basically. And the way the joke works is these three actuaries are out hunting, and a goose flies overhead, and one of the actuaries fires and misses 20 feet to the left. And the second actuary fires and misses 20 feet to the right. And the third actuary jumps up and down and says, "We got it." So that is the way actuarial work works, basically. You're sort of bracketing. But that's also the way the wisdom of crowds works some of the time. So that the idea really is that in any group, if you're trying to solve a problem, people are going to make mistakes. Some people are going to be too optimistic, too pessimistic. Some people are going to guess too high, too low, whatever it is. But the idea is that if the group is diverse, as long as the mistakes people are making are not correlated with each other, then what actually happens is that the mistakes people make, in effect, kind of cancel themselves out. And what you're left with is actually the information and the knowledge in that group. And as we've seen, the knowledge in groups is oftentimes enormously strong. The problem is that if the group is not diverse, then it's much more likely that everyone is going to be making the same kind of errors. And as a result, you're actually going to end up with decisions that are worse than any one member of the group rather than better than any one member of the group. And so diversity is very valuable in that regard as well. Now, diversity is also important when it comes to small groups, like classrooms, like schools in general. Because what it helps you do is it helps you get around some of the problems that small groups oftentimes run into. So the biggest problem groups have is when they're made up of people who are very similar to each other, very similar in background or very similar in outlook, very similar in opinion. Because when you have a group like that, what tends to happen with homogeneous groups is that the more they interact with each other, the more they work with each other, the dumber they become. And the reason for that is that homogeneous groups tend to be really subject to what's sometimes known as groupthink. And groupthink is really the phenomenon where a group really becomes convinced that it has the right answer and finds it very hard to consider alternative possibilities. So there are great examples of this from policymaking and the like, but really what you're talking about in a homogeneous group is that oftentimes what happens is a kind of echo chamber gets set up. People just kind of start to hear their opinions reflected back to them. And so as a result, they become more and more convinced that they're right. And it becomes very hard for them to even really consider the possibility that they might be wrong, hard for them to think about their blind spots, to see what they might be missing, and so on. And so what you really need to do in this circumstance is really try to change that dynamic. The best way to change it is just to have a diverse group to start. There are other possibilities. So we're all familiar with a kind of devil's advocate, right? You want someone who actually will try to change the dynamic by offering up a contrary point of view. And that sometimes works. All the evidence suggests that having even one person who really is willing to challenge what the group thinks can actually make the group smarter. This works in schools, it works in organizations. They've done these studies across a wide range of institutions, and you see the same phenomenon. The catch is that the same person cannot always be the devil's advocate. And that oftentimes happens. You have one person who kind of either self-appoints or the group sort of in effect kind of nominates. Because what happens in that case is that the group sort of has this discussion, and then it says, okay, let's listen to Bob tell us why we're wrong. And Bob stands up and kind of does his spiel, and the group says, okay, let's go ahead and do what we wanted to do in the first place because we're convinced we're right. And we can actually be more confident in our decision because we listened to Bob. And so really what you really need is really that diversity of opinion to kind of emerge organically. Now, there are challenges to this. It's harder, and I don't need to tell you as teachers, it's harder to actually manage oftentimes diverse groups than it is to manage homogeneous ones. We actually like to work with people who are like us. We like to work with people who we agree with. Everything runs much more smoothly generally when that is the case. So it actually takes some work to make a diverse group function smoothly. And I think it's important to actually foreground the value of it, to actually foreground the value of distinct opinions. It's also valuable to actually try to have people in the group be comfortable with disagreement. And I think this is extraordinarily important for you as teachers in terms of the world we're going into. It's extraordinarily important for people to be comfortable with diversity of opinions. It's actually really important for people to be willing and able to argue with each other and still to feel comfortable with each other. That's easier said than done, but I think it's really fundamental to good problem solving, to good decisions, to good collaboration. The way I think of it is that any successful group has to be willing to have what I call a kind of the good fight. You really have to be able to really disagree with each other and then come out at the other end and be able to work together nonetheless. And what's interesting about this is that the groups that are really, really successful are not those, actually, that are most homogeneous in that regard. There's a really fascinating study that was done of Broadway musicals in the 1920s and 1930s. Someone went back and looked at all the Broadway musicals that were produced during that period and looked at those that were, just looked at how successful they were. And then went and looked at the teams that had produced those musicals. And what he found was that the teams that had produced the musicals were not those teams that had worked together the longest or that were made up of people who were incredibly tightly close to each other. Nor were the best musicals, to be fair, made up of the people who were just kind of assembled at random, sort of one-off. What he found instead was that the best Broadway musicals were made up of people, some of whom had worked together for a while, but also that included some new blood, and that actually were diverse as a result of this, that actually had a kind of diversity both of experience, of familiarity with each other, and so on. And that actually those kinds of groups are those that are actually going to be the most creative, the most innovative, and probably the most likely to produce interesting results. Now, the last thing diversity does is that it helps us get around a problem that, at least in the United States, although perhaps not here, students are very, very familiar with, and that is the problem of peer pressure. So peer pressure is enormously powerful. Obviously, it's enormously powerful in school, but it also happens to be enormously powerful pretty much everywhere. It can have a very powerful impact on the kinds of, on the way we actually work together. So the great illustration of this was an experiment that many of you probably remember from, sociology classes. It's an experiment that was done by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. What he did was he put 8 people into a room, and he asked them to solve a relatively simple problem. He showed them 2 cards. One of the cards had 3 lines on it of varying lengths, and the other card had 1 line on it. And the question he asked them was, which of these lines is the same length as this line? Okay? It was a pretty simple problem. He wasn't actually really trying to fool them. But what he did was he showed this group 20 sets of these cards. And the key to the experiment was that of the 8 people in the room, 7 were Ash's Confederates, and 1 was the subject, or really, as it turned out, the kind of victim, basically, of the experiment. Because what they did was the first 4 times through, everyone just named the line that did, in fact, match. But the 5th time through, and every time after that, the first 7 people, he had ordered it so that his 7 guys spoke first. The first 7 people named a line that did not match. And the question was, what would the last person in the room do? So 75% of the people changed their minds at least once. That is to say, named a line that didn't match at least once. A third of the people changed their minds a majority of the time. And when Ash debriefed them later to let them know they weren't crazy, basically, he said, what were you thinking? What was going on in your head? And so some of the people just said, I don't know, I couldn't handle the pressure. I didn't want to be. Ash had told his guys to heckle the last person in the room if they picked the line that was right, actually. So some of them just said, I couldn't handle the pressure. It was too much. It didn't seem like it was worth it. I just went ahead. Some of the people said, and I think this is really relevant to how most of us think about the world, some of the people said, they all seem so certain of themselves that I just assumed I must be missing something. And then a significant minority said something very odd. They actually said, by the end, I did think that line matched. In other words, that their vision of the world had in some respects been changed by what they had heard. Now that sounds, at least to me, a little crazy, but they actually have done this experiment, replicated it, with people hooked up to these fMRI machines. And accepting the limitations of the technology, what they found is that for a significant minority of people, there does seem to be activity in the sort of vision part of the brain when they make these decisions, rather than it being a kind of rational calculation in response to what everyone else is saying. So it actually does raise the possibility that other people's opinions can actually really shape the way we actually see the world. The fMRI experiments are also interesting because what they find is that in those people, in all of these experiments, there's a solid number of people who just, stay true to themselves and go with what they see. What they find in these people is that there's a lot of activity in the kind of fight or flight part of the brain, and that this is enormously stressful. And so this really tells you that standing up against the group when it's saying one thing and you think another actually is an incredibly stressful phenomenon. But what's interesting is that Ash reran his experiment a few years later, and he used the exact same protocols with one difference. Instead of having all 7 of his guys name the line that didn't match, he had 6 of them do it, and he had 1 of his Confederates pick the right line. What's interesting is in that context, the vast majority of people just went along with what they really thought. So it doesn't actually take a lot of diversity necessarily to get people to reveal what they really think, but it does take at least some. Now, the Ash experiment goes into the last characteristic for me of the wisdom of crowds, which is basically independence. And that is basically, what I mean by that is what you really want in any group is you really want people to be thinking for themselves. You really want people to be offering up, their real opinions, and not to be spending a lot of time looking at what everybody else is doing or thinking. And this is true even in the context of collaboration, right? We want people to interact, we want people to collaborate, but we also want people to be willing to bring what they really can offer to the table. Now, in principle, it seems like this should be pretty easy. Most of us pride ourselves on being independent thinkers. School, with kids, it's obviously harder because obviously a lot of our identities are still being shaped. But most of us want to think for ourselves. But in practice, again, it can be hard. And it's not hard, well, the classic illustration of this is an experiment that was done in the 1960s in Times Square. Basically what they did was they put a guy on a street corner, and they just had him gaze up at the sky like this. And they just waited to see what happened. So when they put one person on the street corner, about 5 to 10% of the people walking by stopped and started looking up at the sky. But when they put 5 people on the street corner, 45% of the people walking by stopped and ended up gazing up at that sky. And when they put 8 people on the street corner, that's a lot of people, even in Times Square. Maybe not here, but in Times Square it's a lot. What they found was that 80% of the pedestrians stopped and ended up gazing up at this empty sky. Now, you can look at that experiment and basically say, people are sheep. It's sort of hopeless. The best we can do is guide them in one direction or another. But I actually think what it really demonstrates is that we learn very early on that if a lot of people are doing something, if a lot of people think something, there's probably a good reason for it. And the reason we do this is because it's the way we learn initially, right? We learn from others. But it's also because it works a lot of the time. Imitation is incredibly effective. Let me give you a very banal example from my own life. So I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I have a car. And in Brooklyn, you have to move your car once a week for street cleaning. And you have to move it by 11 a.m. But in New York City, we get a lot of religious holidays. I mean, a tremendous number of religious holidays. And on religious holidays, you don't have to move your car. Street cleaning rules are suspended, which is great. So what this means is that on any given day, you're not really sure whether the rules are in effect or not. Now, there are things you can do. You could go online, which would be the smart thing to do, and just check, or you could call. There's a number you can call to check. I don't do any of those things. What I do is I work at home. So on street cleaning days, what I do is about 10:45, I look outside my window. And if all the cars are still on the street at 10:45, I just say to myself, all right, I guess street cleaning rules have been suspended today, and I don't have to move my car. And I don't go online, I don't check, I just assume that someone in that row of cars has done the necessary work to figure out what's going on. And the interesting thing about this is it has always worked. I have never been burned by this. On days when all the cars are on the street cleaning rules have always been suspended. But obviously, if all or even most of us in that crowd were doing what I was doing, we would be ending up with tickets week after week after week. And this is really one of the challenges when it comes to any group, is that there's an incentive for people to kind of piggyback off the knowledge of others. There's an incentive for people to actually look at what others are doing and try to do, if not exactly the same thing, then maybe something close to it. And the problem is when people are doing that, you're not actually reaping the full benefits. This applies not just to kind of knowledge, it also applies to effort. So lots of studies of collaborative environments, of groups working together, find that in any collaborative group, a significant number of people are basically lollygagging. They're not really working as hard as they can because they're sort of assuming that someone else, often assuming correctly, that someone else will pick up the slack. And so I think one of the real keys to actually making this work well is actually ensuring that people are really contributing what they really think and not spending a lot of time imitating. Imitation is also important because, we tend to be concerned about reputation on one level or another. We want to look like we know what we're talking about. We want to look like we have some basic sense of what's happening. And one way to do that is to look at what everybody else is saying and kind of just go along with the flow. Not only will that sometimes enhance your chances of being right, if it turns out to be wrong, it will give you a ready-made excuse, right? It's a way to kind of protect yourself. And so all of these things militate against people thinking for themselves. And so I think one of the real keys in any group is really pushing people to be willing to actually offer up opinions, actually tell you what they really think, even if those opinions seem odd or really out on a limb. In fact, those opinions are oftentimes the most valuable. Not that they're necessarily right, but that when you integrate them into the group as a whole, you actually really improve your ability to actually solve problems in interesting and useful ways. Now, how can you actually do that? Foregrounding the problem does help. So if you can actually push people to do that, that actually helps. Not as a leader or as a teacher, and this, it sounds to me from talking to Graham, for instance, sounds like something that most of you have already well integrated into your practice, not in a sense trying to dictate or give clues to what the right answer is in advance, is really fundamental. People, students, people in organizations, very good at picking up on what they're supposed to say and then sort of tailoring their opinions to say it. This is probably more of an issue in organizations, but it is a big issue. One of the extraordinary stories that I was told was I gave a talk and someone came up to me afterwards and said that he had been the facilitator at a meeting the day before. He wasn't the boss, he was just the facilitator for the meeting. And that the meeting had begun with the boss giving about a 10-minute presentation. He said 5 minutes into that presentation, 2 different people had sent him revised copies of their PowerPoint presentations because they did not want anything in those slides that the boss would not be happy to hear. And that obviously really lessens, and I think administrators need to take this lesson to heart, because even though it sometimes can be useful or pleasant to actually hear your own ideas reflected back at you, it really means that you're not reaping the true benefits of the group. Anonymity in one form or another can sometimes be valuable, and anonymity maybe overstates the case. But allowing people to actually offer up their opinions in a more freewheeling way, in a way that's not necessarily incredibly rigid, can be very valuable. And here is one place where I think digital technology can be extraordinarily useful. Because in breaking apart the sort of traditional classroom dynamics, I think digital technologies can actually allow students to offer up opinions who otherwise might feel uncomfortable in doing so. And that can be extraordinarily valuable. Obviously, on another level, digital technology allows you to run sort of classrooms on a much bigger scale and to aggregate knowledge across many more people than you would normally be able to do in a traditional setting. So there's a teacher at the University of Texas, Dallas, who's done a lot of interesting work using Twitter with big lecture classes and using that to actually create, in effect, a kind of classroom discussion that otherwise would be logistically impossible. But I think one of the real ideas here is that instead of a kind of traditional model, that actually digital technologies allow you to aggregate knowledge that otherwise would just not even be offered up. The last thing I would say, and this is very relevant probably in a classroom, is that it's really important not to allow a few people to really dominate or dictate the discussion. One of the things you really need to look out for, strangely enough, in any group is really talkative people. So I tend to be very talkative, but one of the things that we know from small groups is that, and you all probably live this every day, is that talkative people have an inordinate impact on group discussions. They have an inordinate impact on group decisions. It's not just that talkative people say more. It's also that when you say a lot, people tend to talk back to you. And so talkative people tend to really shape the attitude and really agenda of any group, really where that group's discussion is going to go. Now, this might be okay just from a strict kind of, are we getting to a good answer perspective, if talkative people were smarter. But as it happens, there is no evidence that there is any correlation between how much someone says and what they know. Now, sometimes I think, oh, that's kind of trivial, but actually it's not. It's actually really extraordinarily relevant to thinking about what makes collaboration work. Because the reason we let talkative people really have such influence is because we kind of assume that they must know what they're talking about because they're saying so much. We actually often do the same kind of deference to people who speak with real authority. So the tone of voice people have oftentimes has an inordinate impact. And the same goes obviously with credentials. The real premise there, in some way, is that we kind of know who we should be listening to. And we are willing, as individuals, to defer to them, in some sense. I think the real lesson of the wisdom of crowds, one of the most important takeaways, is that that deference is really a mistake in every way. And that actually it's really important, not just from a social point of view, not just from a, let's make sure everybody gets to participate point of view. It's actually really important from a problem-solving point of view, from a creative point of view, that the group really be free to speak its mind and not just be dominated by a few people. And so, however we do that, I think that's really essential to making the group as wise and as creative as it really can be. I'm going to end now, but before I go, I want to leave you with one last story, which to me just kind of exemplifies the possibilities that this offers. And it's the story of a submarine, the USS Scorpion, which disappeared on a tour of duty in 1968 in the North Atlantic Ocean. So the submarine had made a last radio transmission and then basically vanished. The Navy had a few clues to go on, but essentially it really had no idea what had happened to the submarine, and therefore had no real idea of how far it might have traveled, or even in what direction it had been going after that last transmission. So when it went out to look for the submarine, it started out in a circle that was many, many miles wide, and it was thousands of feet deep. It was really what looked like on the surface a really impossible task. And the Navy did, in fact, search fruitlessly for a few months, until finally a man came forward, a Navy guy named John Craven. And he said, I think I have an idea for how to find the Scorpion. It was a very eccentric idea. It was actually derived from work he had been reading about on horse racing. But the Navy didn't really have any other options, so they said, all right, go ahead and give it a try. So what Craven did was he assembled a team. It included Navy men, it included submariners, but it also included salvage men, and it included mathematicians. And then instead of just kind of locking them in a room and saying, talk amongst yourselves, what he did instead was he adopted a more formal process. First of all, in consultation with them, he came up with a series of scenarios, things that might have happened to the Scorpion. And he also came up with the factors that they thought were most relevant to actually determining where the submarine had ended up. Then what he asked them to do was he asked each of them individually to bet on how likely each of the scenarios was. So a Russian sub might have hit it, or a torpedo might have gone off in the tube, and so on. And then he asked them to bet on things like how fast do you think the submarine was going, what direction was it traveling in, and so on. When he was done, he took all of the guesses and he ran them through something called Bayes' theorem, which is a formula for quantifying the impact of new information on an old guess. And when he was done, what he came up with was a map of the ocean floor. I actually found this map on Google a few months ago. I'd been looking for it for a while, and it was there. And on this map, there was one spot where Craven's team said, this is where we think the submarine is most likely to be. Now, this was not a spot that any one member of the team had come up with, so that instead of piggybacking on the knowledge of its smartest member, what the team had done instead was come up with a genuinely collective judgment. And they had also come up with a genuinely brilliant judgment. Because a few months after the Scorpion disappeared, the ship finally found it. And it was 220 yards from where Craven's men had said it would be. Now, obviously, no one member of that group knew what had happened to the Scorpion, or knew how far it had traveled, or how fast it had fallen to the ocean floor. But even though no one member of the team knew any of those things, you could say the group as a whole knew them all. And that, for me, is the real promise of the wisdom of crowds. Thank you very much.